Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webcast about Attars. Attars are a very interesting and important aspect of aromatic botanical medicine and something that has actually played a very important role in the history of Floracopeia. So I'm very pleased to be able to share with you a little background about this important aspect of aromatherapy. This is a slideshow primarily, and we're going to cover a lot of different aspects of Attars, from how they are made, a little bit of history, and how they can be used for various kinds of therapeutic purposes. So let's go ahead and get started with the slideshow here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is an old picture of an Attar vendor. And let me introduce the term. First of all, the term Attar is an Arabic word. It is spelled A-T-T-A-R. And sometimes it is also pronounced Ittar or Ottar. Of course, it's easier for a lot of people to just say Attar. Now we need to make a distinction between the term Attar and the term Otto, O-T-T-O. This is something that is frequently confused. The term Otto, O-T-T-O, is a specific term that refers mostly to rose oil. And its meaning is that the oil has been distilled twice. And the reason for that is because when the roses are first distilled, the hydrosol has so much oil that remains in it that it is distilled again, because that rose oil is so precious. Now this is very different than the term Attar. So the term Attar has several meanings, and the general meaning is just fragrance. It just means fragrance, and more specifically it means a type of classical perfume that has been produced in India for many centuries. But the term also refers to the person who sells aromatic botanical medicines. And so that's what this picture is. It's a picture not only of Attars in the bottles, but it is a picture of an Attar. Okay, an Attar meaning the physician who uses aromatic plants for healing. So the aromatic medicines, of course, have a lot of value for supporting our immune system, for uplifting our moods, for helping mental balance and clarity and feelings of well-being emotionally. And this aspect of aromatic medicine is also very closely linked historically to magic and prayer and ceremony and ritual. So therefore, the Attar, the physician or the healer who used aromatic plants, was also the person that you consulted with if you were having emotional difficulties, if you needed to remove obstacles in your life, if you wanted to attract blessings and good fortune and so forth. So this is a bigger definition of Attars. It's the medicine itself. It is the classical Indian perfume, and it is the person who sells aromatic medicines. Now the term Attar, for our purposes here in this presentation, refers to the classical Indian perfumes that have a long history of distillation and production. And these are made in a specific way. They are aromatic plants that are distilled into a base of sandalwood oil. And because sandalwood oil is increasingly rare and expensive and controversial because of its environmental lack of sustainability, the entire industry of making Attars has really declined quite a lot, and they are becoming increasingly rare and difficult to find the real botanical perfume. And of course, this means that they are being adulterated and sold on the market as synthetics primarily. So we're going to talk about some of these complexities here, but let's go ahead and look at how these are made. And I just want to mention that many of these images in this first series are actually photos that were taken by my friend Christopher McMahon during his travels over many years in India, and he was the gentleman responsible for introducing me to his fragrance mentor, Ramakant Harlalka, who I then had the pleasure of traveling in India with several times, and so many of the slides came from my journeys there also. So let's go ahead and move on. And this is to give you a little orientation to the historical origin of the Attar industry, because many of the slides we're going to see next are actually of the old distilleries in Kanauj. Kanauj is a small town outside of Lucknow, where you can see in central North India, near the border of Nepal. And this is where the history of making attars really began. Now, if we look at the history of aromatic treasures, it goes much farther back than just the last 5 or 6 centuries, which is probably how long they've been doing it in Kanauj. It actually goes back tens of thousands of years. Probably aromatic plants other than food plants were some of the first plants that our early human ancestors became familiar with, because they have such pleasant fragrances. And it's been found, for example, that many of the aromatic plants were used in old settlements that are up to 30 and 40,000 years old, because they have pleasing fragrances, they have immune enhancing fragrances that made people feel better, they have insecticidal properties and so forth. But the history of distilling the aromatic plants probably began not with distillation actually, but with infusion, where the aromatic plants were soaked in various kinds of carrier oils to extract their aromatic molecules, and then those carrier oils were applied to the body. And so the development of making attars in the traditional Indian way actually started with the distillation process using equipment such as this. Now, these are large copper pots. They're called degs. And here you can see all of the pieces that are required to make this work. You have the pot, and as you'll see soon, the pot is set inside a stove. And there is a coil of mud. And there is a lid. The lid has a hole in it, and then there's a hammer. And this is simple, primitive distillation equipment. And this is still being used, but not extensively. So let's go to the next slide here, and you can see the beginning of the process. So the attar maker, the distiller, is typically contracted by somebody to custom produce these fragrances. And depending on how strong you want the fragrance, it will cost you because the raw material has to be purchased, and fuel has to be purchased, and sandalwood oil has to be purchased. And the way that this is determined, the strength of the attar, is how many distillations of the flowers or the wood or the other botanical ingredients, how many times they have to be distilled, how many flowers have to go in. So depending on how strong you want it, it will cost you more or less. So the first step of the process then is to weigh out the ingredients that are going to go into the still. The next part is that the ingredients are put into the deg. In this case, we're looking at the marigold flowers, which I'll talk about here towards the end. We're going to talk about some of the different kinds of ingredients that are distilled. Here you can see that they fill the flowers all the way to the top. You can see over on the right-hand side that the deg is completely full with the marigold flowers. So they're preparing a series of distillations here that will all be done at the same time. And this is the champa flowers, which we'll talk about a bit later. And many of these attars now are made just in people's backyards. The old perfume center of Kanauj actually had big operations going with multiple stills, but mostly because of the shortage of sandalwood oil, most of it is now done on a very small scale. Now, once the flowers or other ingredients are put into the deg, then the mud snake goes around the top. And this serves as a seal to the lid. Now, this is a modern type of deg that is using a type of clamp instead of the mud snake, which is a little less traditional, but probably a little easier to work with. The next step is that once the lid is on, or before the lid goes on and is sealed, then the water is poured in over the ingredients. And this is what will be boiled to extract the aromatic compounds. And so I'll mention here for this picture, this is one that I took in Rajasthan. This is at a farm where they were growing roses. And this was actually the distillation of rose attar. And this is something that is also very classical and traditional, is that the stills would be made, they'd be set up and operated on the farms right where the flowers are being harvested. And that way it ensures that the plant material is at maximum freshness. But of course, in Kanauj, the plant material was transported from all over the countryside because that's where the big distillation operations were set up. So the water is poured in, and then the lid is sealed. And here you can see the way that the degs are set up in a fireplace. They're actually built into these brick ovens that have access underneath to building a fire. And that's how the distillation is fueled. So here you can see a small home family still that is now fired up and being heated. So you can start to see here that there is also a distillation pipe that is coming out of the top. And this is a very simple condensing unit, very primitive. It's just a bamboo pipe that sticks out of the top and comes down into the collecting vessel. And here you can see the entire apparatus. And this is in a factory in Kanauj that is most likely not being used extensively. Maybe one of these is fired up at a time. But what you can see now is the entire process of mass distillation, okay, large-scale production that used to happen where they would fill all of these degs with plant material, and then they would put multiple condensing pipes out of the top to gather the steam that is rising from the plant material, and the steam will then come up to the top where the condensing tube goes down into the cooling bath, okay? And so that's the entire process. Really, it's the same as all distillation procedures, except it's very classical, very primitive. So here you can see the entire setup of an old factory for making attars, and that's Ramakant down at the far end, who is framed by the window there, someplace in Kanauj. And so here is the outdoor setting. You can see that there are some fires going. There are some men who are distilling. And so now we come to the next phase of the process. As the fire is heating the water is boiling into steam, the steam is passing through the condensing pipe. But then where is it going? That's the most important part of this whole process. It looks like it's just going into these ponds, but no, that is not the case. You can see in the back there that they're going also into these cooling baths. And this is the most tedious, laborious part of it, is that these men have to stand or sit in these water baths all day doing something. So what is it that they're doing? They are actually rotating these copper vessels that are the collecting unit for the steam that's coming down. And what is inside is sandalwood oil. And so now we come to the most important part of the process that makes Attars unique. And that is that the fragrant hydrosol, which is rich in the aromatic compounds from the various plants, flowers, is collecting slowly in this vessel. And the vessel has sandalwood oil in it. And so what the gentlemen are doing is rotating that vessel all day long. And so they are mixing the hydrosol with the sandalwood oil. And what that will do then is the aromatic molecules will be absorbed into the sandalwood oil. And after one distillation, there will be a very minute amount of fragrance that remains with the sandalwood oil. And so after it has been mixed, well, there's all kinds of mixing of all sorts of things. And you can see that this is probably a fairly pleasant job in hot locations. And so once it has been mixed, which typically takes all day, then the mixing vessel, which is seen here, that is what was in the cooling bath, that's taken out of the water and it's allowed to sit. And what happens then is that the sandalwood oil rises to the top and it leaves behind the residue of the aromatic water, the hydrosol. And so these larger vessels have a small plug at the bottom. And so this gentleman is taking out the hydrosol and allowing the sandalwood oil that's on the top to separate. And so he's basically removing the water element from the oil element. And that process of doing that distillation and separating the aromatic water and mixing it with the sandalwood has taken all day long. And that sandalwood now has a very minute amount of fragrance in it. And so that the collecting vessel, will then sit overnight with the slightly fragrant sandalwood oil in it, and then the entire process will be repeated again the next day. And so sometimes these distillations can go on for weeks and weeks, with the same sandalwood oil being exposed to repeated distillations of the hydrosol. So it's extremely labor intensive, and it uses a lot of fuel, and it uses a lot of plant material, and this is why they are so precious. And because they are so precious, that is also why they are so frequently adulterated with synthetics on the market. So finding the true botanical Attar is actually not so easy now. The majority of things that are on the market are based on synthetic ingredients because the sandalwood's hard to get, very expensive. Not too many people are making these anymore. That's why finding the real thing is a real aromatic treasure. Okay, so this is the final stage. The Attars have to age, but they are aged in a special kind of container, and this is leather, okay? Leather is skin, and if you think about it, the function of skin is to allow certain fluids to come out, like sweat, water, while containing other fluids like blood. So this is membrane filtration technology. And what this does, two things. When the Attars sit in these leather bottles, sometimes for up to a year or more, the water that might have gotten into the sandalwood oil from the distillation process evaporates out, but the sandalwood oil does not. And it also allows the molecules to meld more completely with the sandalwood oil. So this is a question that has come up several times, is what is the shelf life of the Attars? Well, they actually get better with age. And that's because they are in the sandalwood oil, and the sandalwood oil preserves them much longer than just a normal essential oil, but it also deepens and gives them a much richer fragrance as the sandalwood ages. So then, okay, this is just a quick image of the leather bottle here. And so then they go to the market. This is a contemporary Attar vendor. You can think back to our first slide. Not much has changed over the centuries. These are the people who receive the Attars from the distillers and sell them in the marketplace. Now, unfortunately, most of the Attars that are found in the marketplace are synthetic, and most people don't actually know this, and most people don't really care, because most people really like synthetic fragrances. And so the majority of things that are found on the market are not therapeutic. We have to keep in mind that the term aromatherapy means that the therapeutic benefits come from the aroma, but if it's a synthetic compound, they will not give us those therapeutic benefits. As a matter of fact, they will cause problems. They can cause skin reactions, they can cause allergic reactions and headaches and chemical sensitivities and all kinds of things, as any of you with chemical sensitivities or sensitivities to synthetic perfumes know. Now, another important point to mention here is that the Attars are very safe for direct application to the skin. At Floracopeia, we are very conservative and cautious and advise people don't put essential oils directly on your skin. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's best to dilute them if you don't know the specific species and if you don't know about the individual skin condition. Now, the reason that the Attars are so safe is because of the base of sandalwood oil. Now, sandalwood oil is actually one of the essential oils that is very benign and very safe for almost everybody. I don't think I have heard one case of anybody getting a bad reaction from true sandalwood oil. Synthetics, possibly, and a lot of sandalwood on the market is synthetic, but true sandalwood is very emollient. It's actually moisturizing and anti-inflammatory for the skin and very low risk of dermotoxic potential. And so the Attars can be considered very safe for direct application to the skin, which we'll talk about in the final section about how to use them. Now, one of the big questions that comes up is about the use of the sandalwood. And this is very problematic. I will explain what we are doing about it and a little bit of history here, because sandalwood is the primary ingredient that goes into all of the Attars. And because sandalwood is now highly endangered and very protected, the availability of sandalwood for making Attars is very limited. Now, there's different species, and that's one of the clues here to how do we get around this particular problem. But I wanted to cover, first of all, a little overview of the Santalum alba. This is the sandalwood that comes from South India. This is the one that has always been used in the classical Indian preparations. This is typically found in Mysore and Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And so this is a picture of a sandalwood forest, and these are preserves that are now very inaccessible to the public because they're all fenced off and you have to have special permission to go in. But there are many trees that are in these preserves, many old trees. I've had the good fortune to visit the sandalwood forest, specifically of Kerala, 3 different times and go to different areas and locations and talk to the foresters and see the reforestation efforts and see what they're doing. So What makes the sandalwood oil particularly challenging is that you have to kill the tree to get it. You can't distill it from the leaves or the branches. It's concentrated in the heartwood and the roots. And the older the tree, the better quality the oil and the more oil it will have. And so really, a tree has to be about 50 years old in order to get really good oil. And if it's 100 years old, it's extremely valuable. And talking with some of these foresters, we did some calculations and figured that one old growth tree, if it was poached by sandalwood poachers, which happens all the time, and carried out to Mumbai, was probably worth about $50,000. And so that's a great temptation anywhere in the world, but especially in India, where $50,000 will go a very long ways. So these are the old growth trees in the sandalwood preserves. And this is what the inside of a old growth tree looks like. It's very, very fragrant. It's very rich in oil, and that is what is distilled. And so this is a photograph of old growth trees. You can see that there's a small fortune of these logs here. And this is in one of the forestry department offices. Keep in mind that in these preserves that trees do die, and they die from old age, or they get knocked down in storms, or sometimes they get knocked over by the wild bison. So there's different ways that the trees do die a natural death and are not plundered. And so the forestry department actually does have sandalwood that is produced. But typically, it's very difficult to get this sandalwood. They usually offer it at auction once a year in these very large amounts, hundreds of kilos at a time. Extremely expensive, and this is really for exclusive buyers with large amounts of money. But it is possible to get Santalum alba, true old growth sandalwood, legally harvested from sustainable sources through the forestry department. But for a small company such as us, just buying a few liters at a time, this is not really possible. We have been very fortunate to be able to supply this oil through legal, sustainable channels once in a while, but not very often. And so this is typically not the sandalwood oil that we have. And so the sandalwood logs then are broken up into smaller pieces, into chips, and of course this is all done manually, very labor intensively, and then it's distilled. Now in India, there are many reforestation efforts that are underway. What you can see here are the seedlings. Now what makes sandalwood complicated, not just because of the fact that it's the old growth trees that have to be taken down in order to get the oil, it's also that it doesn't grow well. Sandalwood requires very complex ecological conditions in a complete healthy forest. It is semi-parasitic with other trees and plants, which means that you can't just sprout them in a nursery and go out and plant them. Now, we're going to meet the Agarwood trees here shortly, which is a species you can do that with. But sandalwood is having more of a challenge because it doesn't grow back so well. But there are some success stories, and because the tree is so valuable, there's a lot of economic incentive now to plant a lot of sandalwood forests. And so this is a picture from one of the Indian preserves. And there are other species that are also being replanted. In the past, we have offered the Santalum austrocaladonicum from the Vanuatu Islands. And there is quite a lot of reforestation and replanting of sandalwood going on there. It's a very nice oil, and it can also be used as a base for attars. And so these are the seedlings in Vanuatu that are being replanted in a number of different projects. And this is what it looks like when they are several years old. It's basically agroforestry. The seedlings go back into the forest, and because they do thrive if they're put into a complete healthy forest ecosystem, then after many years, the smaller trees will start to come up. Now this is a different species, and I wanted to mention this because this is currently in our line of products. This is the Santalum spicatum that comes from Australia, and we are working with an organization now that is distilling the Australian sandalwood oil from a highly regulated industry where the old trees are harvested, the sick trees are harvested, and everything is controlled very carefully by the government. There's a very limited supply of the wood available and a very limited supply of the oil available, therefore. So what we are currently doing is using the Australian sandalwood as a base for one of our favorite Attars, which is the Agarwood Attar, and I'll explain that next. So now we see that there are several species of sandalwood that are found on the market, and it's the South Indian species of Santalum alba that is actually the most endangered and the most problematic, the most expensive, the most plundered, the most illegal, and therefore also the most adulterated, with people mostly finding the synthetic version of it, both as sandalwood oil on the market and the base of the Attars. But because we also have the Austrocaledonicum and we have the spicatum that are available somewhat more sustainably and are also being replanted more with more success, then we have the opportunity then to support agroforestry in some specific cases, some specific projects, and it also gives us the opportunity to make our own Attars using oil that is not so problematic ecologically or politically. So now let's look at another endangered species and one of our favorite ingredients, one of the world's favorite ingredients in perfumery and also for making Attars, and that is agarwood. And this is an old growth tree, and old growth agarwood trees now are extremely valuable. And because of that, they're very problematic. There's an entire black market. There's a lot of plundering. There's a lot of violence around this. And so we don't want to be involved in that. And so we are supporting the people who are replanting it. Now, agarwood is interesting because in the normal forest setting, it doesn't always produce agarwood oil. It requires a kind of infection. Specifically, it's a fungal infection to get into the heartwood. And so here you can see on this image that there's an opening in the heartwood, and that makes it vulnerable to the fungal infection, and the immunological response to the fungus is what produces this beautiful, fragrant resin to be produced. And so this is a picture in Thailand of the agarwood tree that has been infected. And what you see there is the heartwood that has been responding to the fungus with its immunological reaction. And then that heartwood is taken out. And so this is a piece of wood that is very rich in resin. And this will show up on the market in two different ways. One is this can be distilled into an oil, extremely valuable, very valuable oil. One of the most expensive, probably the most expensive essential oil on the market, up to hundreds of dollars per milliliter, which is basically like a few drops. And you will also find this on the market as wood chips. Now, we don't deal with these old growth products because they're simply too problematic. There's also a huge amount of adulteration with the oil in the wood. Typically, the oil goes through 10 hands on its way to the final buyer, and at each of those steps, it is usually adulterated. And so most of the agarwood oil that's on the market is adulterated, and also now a lot of the wood is adulterated. They have found all kinds of tricky ways to take normal pieces of wood and soak them with synthetic fragrance to make them look and smell like agarwood, and they're not. They're toxic products. Now, agarwood is a very big reforestation and agroforestry industry now because it's so valuable. So this is a picture from a nursery in Vietnam where a lot of these saplings are planted. There's a very big industry in Vietnam and in Thailand and in Laos and the Southeast Asian area. Also in Sikkim is a major center. And so the agarwood trees actually thrive more easily than sandalwood. They don't require such complicated conditions. They grow fairly quickly. And so here's the nursery. This is a nursery in Sikkim that has been run for many decades, actually, by a gentleman that we procure some of our wood and oil from. And he has been doing a lot of work regionally, encouraging people to grow agarwood trees because it's such a valuable cash crop. And so this is the first stage of the seedlings. And then after that, they are planted. And this is from a project in Vietnam, again, where the trees are planted on devastated landscapes that were affected by deforestation, cattle grazing, the war, and so forth. And they grow very quickly. So that first picture was actually trees that were just a couple years old, and now these trees are about 10 years old. You can see that they grow quite fast. Okay, so they're a very good agroforestry product. And so these are trees that are about 30 years old in Sikkim, and these are very, very valuable. So the modern agroforestry production of agarwood is generally based on inoculating the trees with the fungus. And so the trees are drilled, and a kind of fungal compound is injected into the trees, and then they're sealed up like that. And so this causes a fungal infection in the tree. And so that way the entire forest can be producing the agarwood oil, not just in the trunks, but also in the branches. And that's where a lot of the sustainable agarwood and agarwood oil is now coming from, because you don't actually have to cut the tree. You can just trim the branches and you'll be able to distill it. Now, the quality of the oil in the wood, of course, is not as good as the old growth trees, but the oil is much more easily accessible. Now, we are getting oil from a very important and very interesting reforestation project in Thailand, and they are growing the trees in such a way that they will become infected naturally. So these trees are drilled that make them vulnerable to the fungal infection, but they're not actually injected with anything. And so that makes the oil a higher quality. It's cleaner. It doesn't have any of these synthetic ingredients in it. It's just a natural infection that tends to hit the tree because it's immunologically weakened by having the holes drilled in it. Okay, so that is where we are getting our oil currently. And here's what it looks like after the tree has been infected. Naturally, the oil starts to grow inside it. And so this is what the sustainable wood looks like. It's obviously not as dark and rich in oil as the old growth, but it's sustainable. Okay, it's a project where they are replanting the trees all the time and harvesting the older trees, and this is actually becoming a very viable form of agriculture in this area in Thailand near the border of Laos. And then the wood is distilled into the oil. I just thought I'd give you a picture here of the distillation process. And one of the nice things about agroforestry with a crop such as agarwood trees is that other things can be grown underneath it while the trees are maturing. And so this is a field of patchouli that is being cultivated underneath the agarwood trees as they are slowly maturing. And so this is what patchouli looks like. It needs to be fermented a little bit before it goes into the still to get the really high quality oil. So now we come to some of the other ingredients that go into Attars, and many of these are the flowers. There's quite a number of species that are distilled. And so here we have a little picture of the Mumbai flower market. This was a picture that I took during one of my travels with Ramakant. And the flower market is actually the source of a lot of flowers for the distillers. And a lot of these things are seasonal. For example, the champa flowers only come into the market 1 month out of the year, and mostly they go to the public. They go to the people who are buying the flowers for all kinds of weddings and festivities and garlands and offerings at the temples, and that leaves relatively little for the distillers. And so the distillers have to make arrangements with the harvesters if they're buying through these markets. And this, of course, is one of the larger markets in the country, but every town has a flower market. And so the distillers have to get their flowers from the local markets. And that also is one of the reasons why the Attars are somewhat rare and expensive, is that it requires so much floral material, and the floral material tends to go to all of these other buyers first. And so here you can see all the different forms that the flowers come in. And of course, thinking back to the Degs, you can realize that tons and tons of flowers go into the production of a single Attar. So another very important Attar, we just finished the Agarwood, but I forgot to mention something very important here about the Agarwood, and that is that the oil that is being distilled in Thailand in that sustainable project, that is what is going into the sandalwood from Australia. And so our Agarwood Attar, which is one of our favorite products, is made from completely sustainable ingredients. And so it is composed of the Australian sandalwood that we have infused the Agarwood oil from the sustainable project in Thailand into. So we can feel very good about that product. So another Attar that's very famous is the Attar of jasmine flowers. And there are several kinds of jasmines, and there are several names, of course, to the jasmine. And there is the jasmine sambak, which is the night blooming jasmine, and there's the jasmine grandiflorum, which is typically called the dawn blooming jasmine. And these have two different names. I'm going to cover some of the names of the Attars here. The Agarwood Attar is typically called Oud. Okay, Agarwood is Oud, O-U-D. And then the jasmine sambak, the night blooming jasmine, is also known as Motia. And then the jasmine grandiflorum, which is the dawn blooming, is frequently called Chameli. Okay, so I'll give you these names for those of you who are familiar with the Attars. So jasmine is distilled into sandalwood and makes a beautiful perfume. It has these different names according to the species. This is the night blooming, the Motia. And this is the grandiflorum, Chameli. Therapeutically, they're pretty much interchangeable, but I'm going to unpack this a little bit more when we get through the brief introduction. A very famous one, of course, is also the rose. And so this is a picture of the Damascena rose that is cultivated in Rajasthan. This is actually cultivated on that farm where I showed you the stills from. And so these were harvested fresh and put directly into the still and distilled right there. And so this is the farm, actually, where that rose Attar was coming from. Okay, another one here is the pink lotus. And the lotuses are also very famous for making the Attars. All the three main types. There's the pink lotus, the white lotus, and the blue lotus. And they're very distinct fragrances. They don't actually have much of a floral smell. They're more, the pink and the white are very medicinal smelling, a little pungent, and not what you would think. It's the blue lotus, actually, which is the most floral. Here's some pink and blue lotuses in the Mumbai flower market. And this is the blue lotus, okay? And it's a little bit of a botanical confusion because it's not actually, the typical name is blue lotus, but blue lotus now appears to be extinct, or possibly that there is one small collection of them in a botanical garden somewhere. But the classical blue lotus that was mentioned historically is not found. Instead, what is blue lotus is actually a water lily. And so it's not even blue really, it's more like a lavender color. And so this is typically called blue lotus, but it's really, it's not Nelumbo, it's Nymphaea. And so this is a lavender water lily called blue lotus. Another very popular ingredient for the classical Indian attars is the champa flower. And the champa flowers are actually quite large and very popular in the market. They go into many products such as garlands and offerings to the temples. They're extremely fragrant. They're actually a type of magnolia. So you may know the magnolia flower, but this is the golden magnolia flower from India. And champa is distilled into sandalwood. And so here we have another picture of the home deg being filled with champa flowers. And so the champa attar is one of our more popular attars. Another one that we have had in the past is the tuberose. And tuberose is classical attar, and very, very nice. And white ginger lily. Now we have a unique attar that is made from white ginger lily that is in a base of vetiver oil. And this is a different base than sandalwood oil. Of course, it gives a different fragrance and different therapeutic properties, but it's one of the solutions for how do you get away from the sandalwood problems. And so the white ginger lily is infused into the vetiver oil and gives a very beautiful contemporary type of attar with more of an earth note as opposed to a wood note from sandalwood. Another popular attar is the saffron, and of course that's very expensive because this is one of the more expensive ingredients in the world. It requires many, many stamens of the saffron flower that are all hand plucked, so it makes it a very costly ingredient for saffron to be used. Okay, now here's an interesting picture. You will immediately recognize it as henna. And I'm introducing this because there are a couple of terms that are somewhat interchangeable. They're confusing, actually. They're not interchangeable, they're just confusing. There's henna, and then there's hina, and then there's gulhina. Okay, now henna is the green powder from the leaf of a specific plant, and that is used obviously for adornment, artistic adornment. Now the henna plant also has a flower, and that flower is distilled, and that is called gulhina attar. And so there's henna that is used for decoration, and then there is gulhina, which is the flower from the same plant that is used for making attars. Then there's what's called Hina. Hina is H-I-N-A, and Hina is actually a group of attars that are fairly well known, and these are all very different. This is a question that comes a lot. What are the ingredients of Hina? Well, Hina is a recipe that includes a lot of different roots and barks and flowers and spices, and typically it's a family secret. So it's a masculine, musky, woodsy, spicy, warming type of attar that is typically used more in the winter. Most of the other attars that are flower-based are more cooling, used in the summer. And so we'll have a few more words about the therapeutics coming here in a moment. But I also wanted to show you one more that's very interesting that we have had in the past. We get it periodically, and this is called miti. Miti means baked earth. And so you might wonder, well, why would anybody want to wear a perfume that smells like mud? Well, this particular fragrance actually has a story and a lot of emotional meaning for people in India, because traditionally India was an agrarian culture. It still is, but it is very modernized. And in an agrarian culture, there is really nothing more important than the rain coming on time. And so in India, there are basically 3 seasons. And the first is the dry, hot season that goes on, and everything becomes extremely dehydrated. And then the rain starts to come, and that is the planting season. And then afterwards, everything is growing and lush and green, and that's the 3rd season. So the coming of the rain is extremely important, and especially after a long, hot, dry summer, the clouds start to build up. And when the first raindrops fall on the soil, they produce this amazing fragrance. As the soil comes back to life, the microbial ecology comes back to life. And those of you who live in desert areas where the soil does become very dry and then the rain comes, you know that it's a beautiful fragrance. And so the perfumers of India wanted to capture that fragrance of the first monsoon rain on the soil, because it's so special in terms of the emotional connotations, the memories of that first monsoon rain every year. And so what is done then is that the mud from riverbanks and lakes and different areas is taken and made into these basically mud pies that are dried, and then the mud pies are distilled into the sandalwood oil. And what happens is the fragrance is infused in the sandalwood oil, and then you have the sandalwood oil that smells like earth. And this is a very beautiful fragrance that a lot of people really like, actually. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the therapeutics. The primary place where we see attars being used therapeutically is in Ayurvedic medicine. And these are fragrances that are associated with various marma points. This is an old Tibetan chart of the marma points. The marma points are the energy centers of the body. They are also the acupuncture points, acupressure points. They're places where if you massage them, they will have a specific influence on the surrounding tissues and will then have a systemic effect. And so in Ayurveda, there are actually different systems where different attars were applied to the different points during aromatherapy. Now, for everyday use, a way that we can think of attar applications is that they're just worn as perfume, and they can be applied on the radial artery at the wrist, or they can be applied on the neck, behind the ear. They can be applied on the sternum, the heart center, basically anywhere you like as a perfume. The main difference with using attars as a perfume and a modern synthetic perfume is that because they are botanical sources, botanical ingredients, they will not stay on the skin as a mono fragrance that will be there all day long. They will digest. They'll become part of your own body chemistry. So traditionally, the way that people used attars was that they carried around a little pouch that had a variety of attars, and they would apply them routinely throughout the day. And they could just apply them depending on whichever mood they were in, whatever they wanted to use, because you can easily blend them and they will blend on the skin. And by the end of the day, you will have your own unique fragrance that will either come from one attar that you have applied several times that has become metabolized as part of your own chemistry, or it will be a blend that has metabolized with your chemistry. And so basically, you become the fragrance. You become the fragrance blend through applying them all day. Now, for a very short and simple overview of the therapeutics, what we can say is that first of all, we have the base of sandalwood. That's the most important. And sandalwood oil actually has very subtle kinds of effects, but they're very important. First of all, it's soothing, anti-inflammatory for the skin. And so, as I mentioned, it's very safe, low dermotoxic potential. And sandalwood can also be beneficial for certain types of dry and inflamed skin conditions. We would say vata is the dryness and pitta is the inflammation. So therefore, the sandalwood oil as the base of the Attars is generally helpful for dry, inflamed skin conditions. Not that you would like to use lots of it because it's so expensive, but if you apply a little bit, it could be therapeutically helpful for that particular purpose. Now, sandalwood is generally regarded as having a very sattvic effect, meaning that it calms the upset emotional mind, okay? It settles the emotions. It helps the mind to become more clear, stable, and focused, and full of spiritual qualities. And so sandalwood oil is a very good oil for applying before a meditation. You could say that the Attars, therefore, are very good for anointing yourself before you sit down to have meditation. Or if you just come home after a stressful day, you could apply a few of these Attars, either individually or in combination, or just sandalwood oil will do this, and then just sit down and relax. And the fragrance will help you to make the transition from being overly stimulated mentally, having the overstimulated sympathetic nervous system, you'll be able to transition into a relaxed state physiologically more rapidly. Okay, so that's the basic function of all the Attars, because they do have sandalwood oil in them, is they have a calming kind of effect. And that's one of the reasons why traditionally the Attars were always considered to be aromatic medicine that helped us with our spiritual evolution. Well, why is that? Because it helps us to maintain a more balanced state of mind and emotions. Okay, so they're protective from emotional disturbances. They're protective of mental negativity. And they're also immunologically protective, because the fragrance, as we know, the essential oils have very significant antimicrobial effects. All right, so that's the main properties of the sandalwood oil. Now, the Agarwood oil is also very profound in its relaxing effects, but also uplifting. And so the Agarwood Attar is a favorite because it's really a very, very deep, woody, sweet, resinous kind of fragrance that has a wonderful calmative effect on the nervous system and is also very conducive to helping with meditation, concentration, relaxation. Burning the Agarwood wood itself as an incense, it's one of the most widely used incense ingredients in Asian incense making, and especially found in the Taoist and the Buddhist temples in Japan and China. It has a profound supportive effect on meditation practice, and the oil will do the same thing. The floral Attars, and that includes rose, and jasmine, and champa. Those are the three main ones that are usually found on the market. These are generally cooling by nature. The flowers are anti-pitta, so they would be used more in the hot season, or they would be used more for when you're feeling overheated. And also, these are famous ingredients for perfumery in general. And perfumery, of course, is used for enhancing romantic and erotic moods. And so these flowers also are very, very nice to use for this purpose. And then the Mitti Attar, since I mentioned it, I'll tell you a little bit about the therapeutics of that. This one is actually very calmative for the nervous system. Earth is grounding. It's really anti-vata. Okay, so that one is a very, very, very nice one for relaxing the nervous system. I'll mention another attar. I didn't include a picture of it, but it's important. It's a relatively common attar, and we have carried it at times, and that is the attar of vetiver. And this is also known as kus or kus or kush, depending on where you are in India. The vetiver root is distilled into a base of sandalwood. Now, I did mention that we have the attar of the white ginger lily flower infused in vetiver. Now, vetiver is also calming to the nervous system, but it's also cooling. It has an interesting dual function where it calms the vata, meaning that it's relaxing, grounding, soothing for the nervous system and for muscular tension and for emotional upset and tension, but it's also cooling and anti-inflammatory. So vetiver oil actually in aromatherapy is really nice for muscular tension where there's a combination of tightness and heat. So you can think about that for the use of the vetiver and white ginger lily attar. Okay, so that is a very brief overview of a very big subject, which has taken a bit of time to cover all of these aspects of where do these attars come from, a little bit of history, how they're made, some of the ingredients, some of the complexities, and some of the therapeutic applications. But obviously there's a lot more to talk about, but for sake of time, we will wrap it up now with a short clip of a great Ayurvedic physician who was very well known, Dr. Vasant Lad, who I had the great pleasure of interviewing at a NAMA conference, the National Association, National Ayurvedic Medical Association, several years ago. And I just asked him a simple question about attars, and he has some wonderful things to say. So let's enjoy Dr. Lad. Would you say a few words about your experience using attars for aromatherapy? I know that you are
the master of Attar.
I know that you love Mitti Attar in particular. Could you tell us something about that?
Good. You know, this Attar preparation, you are most acquainted with it, but it is organic, non-chemical, non-alcoholic basis. This Attar can be used as a aromatherapy, can be used for aromatherapy, and generally in India we use sandalwood or mitti or hina, khas during summer season, hina during winter season, and during fall the best is mitti. And we just one drop of attar is applied to the radial artery, carotid artery, and heart, little sternum, and one drop to the center of the head. And suddenly these molecules of attar, they acquire your auric field, your entire aura becomes fragrant. And wherever you go, you are highly welcomed by the people. Apart from that, it has a great self-healing power, attar. Okay, so thank you for joining me on this little presentation. I hope that you have found it interesting, intriguing, and helpful as far as your understanding of this unique and increasingly rare, actually, form of aromatic botanical medicine. You know, the way that I think about these is these are real treasures. These are real aromatic treasures for all the reasons that I described. They represent a long period of history. These attars are really centuries old, and the lineage of distillation goes back a very long way. So when we can actually get the real material, we are partaking of something that goes back a long ways in terms of culture and history and Ayurvedic medicine, therapeutic applications, and so forth. And so I always enjoy when we have these really fine attars available because they're not that easy to get anymore. So
thank you for joining me, and I hope that you enjoyed this little presentation.